So yes, we're going to go for a virtual walk down Orange Street. We're going to start at the Isaac's house and we're going to end up at the Grossweiner's house and we'll visit a few families in between.
God, Grossweiner.
And so this series of walks is called Following Their Footsteps. And this is the first of the series of walks. So there are many more to follow. The ones that I've advertised and the ones that I haven't written yet, including the last one. So you may have to help me out with that one. So, like most of our projects, we did have a grant to fund this from the St. John Community Arts Board. So we had the grant for a couple of years, but I'm not the fastest writer on the planet. So there we are.
But you're the busiest.
And so we're going to talk about the Isaacs family, the Cohen family, the Weasels, the Bernsteins, the Liebermans, the Gusses, the Kalps, and the Grossweiners. And I'm just going to pull my notes over here. So in case anybody ever wondered how Orange Street got its name, it was named for Frederick, the Duke of Orange, who fought and died in the Napoleonic Wars. If anybody remembers that from ancient history. And it is one of the streets in the Heritage Preservation District in St. John. I'm going to start at the corner, Princess, not Princess, good heavens, I'm going the wrong way, Sydney, and work our way along. So the first house we come to is 21 Orange Street. Oh, actually, before I even get to that, I have a little preamble. And anybody who lived on Orange Street knows that this was a wonderful place to live. And this was something that I have from Susan Isaacs Lubin. And she centers it around the house where her family lived. And she says the house was built in the 1920s by Lyle Isaacs, my grandfather. The house consisted of 2 apartments on the first floor, one that my grandmother, Millie Isaacs, lived in. And the other occupied by Lori and Ruth Isaacs and their family, Leslie and Lyle. The Ralph Isaacs family occupied the entire second floor. My father, Ralph, mother, Julia, my sisters, Elise, Elizabeth, or Betty Ann, and me, and our blonde Cocker Spaniel dogs, Blondie, Honey, and Sugar. Next door to us is 23 and Freda Cohen and their children, Ed and Sharon. They later moved up to the next block of Orange Street. Sharon and I had a contest.
Get everybody on one thing.
Most double bubble gum at once. At 25 Orange were Eli and Esther Boyaner. And I'm going to save the Boyaner family story for the Elliott Row walk, just so this doesn't become too long. And this
Who's doing the talk?
What is it?
Okay.
In the next block,
Curator.
70 Orange Street was the B.R. Gus family, Ben, Millie, Karen, Judy, Faith, and John. Judy was my age and we were very close friends. We used to walk each other home and then back part way and stand on the corner of Orange and Carmarthen Street and talk for hours while our parents were waiting for dinner. Next door to them were the Abe Kalps, Abe, Fina, Marie, Lucy, and Francine. My sister Elise and Francine were friends. And across the street were the Liebermans, Joe, Ada, Stan, and Avron.
Relatives of the ones in Edmonton.
Yeah. So 21 Orange Street. Because these are in a preservation district, there are architectural notes on the building. So this house dates from 1925. It's a craftsman style house. Still looks pretty much the same and has been very well preserved. And there were 3 apartments inside, all occupied by the Isaacs family. And the Isaacs were the 3rd Jewish family to arrive in St. John, starting with the brothers Abraham and Israel Isaacs, who arrived in 1871. And they married daughters of the Hart family, who were the first Jewish family to arrive. And both of these families were in the tobacco business, and the Isaacs had a factory on Princess Street. Lyle Isaacs was born in 1871 as the son of Abraham and Jenny Hart Isaacs, and he married Millie Marks in December of 1905, and they had 3 children, Ralph, Lawrence, and Ruth. Lyle Isaacs became the owner of the American Clothing House, a menswear store that his father had started in 1905. The store had started at 22 King Street, but then moved to 9 Charlotte Street in 1910. When Lyle Isaacs died, on December 19th, 1929, his wife Millie and son Ralph carried on with the store. And Lyle Isaacs was also active as a musician and was a member of what was called Harrison's Orchestra. Millie Isaacs was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1880, and she came to St. John when she got married. She worked alongside her husband at the American Clothing House, and she was the bookkeeper and the cashier. And the store sold men's clothing, as I mentioned, and supplied army uniforms during the Second World War, and as well to the police. But Millie Isaacs was also busy outside of the store. She was the recording secretary for the Daughters of Israel from 1904 to 1930, and was elected the president of that organization in 1930. And she was also the secretary for the local council of women. So clearly this was something she had a talent for, because she spent another 10 years doing that. And she was the first Jewish woman elected as a member of the IODE, the Daughters of the Empire.
Imperial.
So I can't imagine there were too many Jewish members of that.
No kidding.
And she died in 1955.
Susan is too. Susan is too. What? Member of the IODE.
Okay. And there were 3 children. So we'll go through them one by one, starting with Ralph, who was the oldest, born in 1904. He was one of the founders of Young Judea, which I think most of you were probably a member of at one time or another. He was also the president of the Young Men's Hebrew Association. He was also the scoutmaster, maybe not in the time of anybody here, but looked after that. He was the treasurer of the synagogue in 1948, and he was the president from 1960 to 1963. Now, he also carried on with the American Clothing House store, which closed in 1960. And he then went on to join the St. John Planning Commission. And one of the ideas they had during his time was to turn King Street into a pedestrian mall. But if you haven't been to St. John lately, I can assure you it is far from a mall, and the cars still go up and down all day long. So Ralph Isaacs married Julia Smith in 1933, and this is their wedding picture, as you can see.
I can't see the pictures.
Oh dear, that's not good. So Julia was born in 1907 in New York. Her parents were Elias and Anna Smith. And after the death of her father, she moved to St. John with her mother and her brother. And her brother Abraham E. Smith was involved in the film business, probably one of the first people involved in film distribution. So he brought the family to St. John. Julia Smith was a leader in the Hadassah. So she served as president, and she was active regionally and nationally in that organization. She worked for a time as well at the American Clothing House with her husband. And for a brief time, she had her own maternity shop across the street. And I love the name of the store, the Stork Shop. Because I guess in those days, all the babies came by stork. So I thought that was rather cute. And it was only for a year or two that she had the store. And in turn, they had 3 daughters, Elise, Elizabeth Ann, and Susan. All 3 of these girls went away to university. So Elise and Betty Ann both graduated from Brandeis Universities. Elise Weisbach now lives in Michigan. Betty Ann was a librarian in California, and she passed away a few years ago. And Susan, as you probably know, became a lawyer. She was a clerk of the courts in St. John, and she also was an adjudicator for the small claims court. She married in 1983, and I forgot to turn the slide. Whoops. But she's also the last member of the Isaacs family living in St. John. Oops. I think my notes are getting ahead of me. So this is Lawrence Isaacs, the second child in that family. So he was born in 1907. He was a salesman, so he traveled throughout the maritime provinces. He was also a very good singer, and he participated in the YMHA shows in the 1930s and 1940s that were directed by Mitchell Bernstein, who we'll get to
There's
in
a
a few
Hampton
houses.
Inn over there.
And his wife came from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, Frances Ruth Shane, and they married in 1938. And they had 2 children, Leslie and Lyle. So Leslie, who's here somewhere and on our walk, after graduation, she went to Israel. She lived for 20 years. And if you go to the museum webpage, you'll see a link to her story living in Israel for that time.
The car accident.
No, it was in the Laurentians. He was at
Catherine, can you mute everybody from your end? Because this is not going to be good on the recording with all the background noise.
Okay, let me see if I can find the.
Or could the few people who have not yet muted, please put yourself on mute because it's being recorded.
Okay, I think I can. All right. So this is Leslie and her family here. And on the next screen, we do have Lyle. And we all know that Lyle was very special. He graduated from St. John High with high honors and was the outstanding student for that year. He was, I lost my spot. He spent a year in Israel on a leadership program, and he was also the national president of Canadian Young Judea. And of course, he was the Young Judea leader in St. John that everybody looked up to. And of course, tragically, he died in 1970 in a car accident in Huntsville, Ontario. But somewhere in Israel, there in Canada Park, there were planted 1,000 memorial trees. So let's see. And then finally, Ruth Isaacs, who grew up in St. John but moved to New York, and she became a librarian after graduating from McGill University and the School of Library Science in New York. She ended up as the head librarian for the British Information Service. And as part of her job, she was making frequent trips from New York to London, and she would stay in London for months at a time. And she made these journeys back and forth across the Atlantic on luxury liners. She even had a chauffeur to work when she was in London, which I think is very nice. And the importance of her position led to her receiving an invitation to attend the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953. And she had a seat inside Westminster Abbey, which I think is pretty neat. My grandmother was at the same event, but she was somewhere out in the street. I'm not sure if any of us are going to get invitations to the coronation coming up in May, but if you do, think of the rest of us. And Ruth Isaacs died in the year 2000 and is buried in Montreal. So the Isaacs house is still there. It's now owned by Diana Alexander. And throughout last summer, every time we went by, there was scaffolding and workmen about the place. So it looks really nice right now. So our next stop is right next door at 23 to 25 Orange Street. Now, the Boyaner family did live here for a period of time, but like I said, you'll have to come back for the Elliott Row walk to hear their story. And I'm going to focus on the Weasel family and on the Cohen family. So this is another craftsman style house, and it dates from 1924. So Herman Weasel bought this house in 1931, and the Weasels lived in this building until 1944. So the Herman Weasel came from Siget, Hungary, or Romania. I think the border may have the wrong country. And he came to St. John with his brother Joseph and his sister Doris. And in 1908, Herman and Joseph Weasel opened Weasel's Shoe Store at 241 Union Street. And I'm sure everybody from St. John bought their shoes there at some point or another. And the store became the largest shoe store in the Maritime provinces. And they had the goal of selling the highest quality shoes at the lowest possible prices. The store did move to King Street in 1949. Not very good at getting these slides turned. So Herman Wiesel was married to Anna Stern, and the Stern family had a farm just outside the city in South Bay. Most of the rest of the family went back to Vineland, New Jersey in the 1920s. But Anna Stern Wiesel and two of her sisters, Nellie Hoffman and Jenny Bramberg, stayed in St. John. And if you want to hear about those ladies, you'll have to come back for the Leicester Street walk. And they had 3 children. So Lawrence Earl was born in 1915, and he made his mark on the world as a writer, first for the Red and Gray at the St. John High School, and then went on to write for the Montreal Standard. During the Second World War, he was a correspondent in Northwestern Europe between 1943 and 1945. And he was positioned right alongside the troops at the front lines. And he did 2 wartime broadcasts for CBC Radio. The interesting thing is, you'll note he doesn't carry the last name Wiesel. He changed his name during the Second World War because had he fallen into enemy hands, if you were Wiesel, they knew you were Jewish, and he would have had the misfortune to have a much different outcome, perhaps, than the men he was picked up with. So he did change his name. He married another war correspondent in 1943, and she was writing for the Montreal Standard as well. They lived in England from 1946 until the 1990s, but lived in Grand Bay in retirement. And in addition to writing for newspapers and magazines, he also wrote 7 books. I'll just mention 2 of them. One of them, The Battle of Baltinglass, won the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor in 1953. I've read the book. Humor changes over time. And the Yangtze Incident, which was published in 1950. And this was a movie made into a movie that was shown at the Cannes Film Festival. So next up is Gladys Wiesel Davis. She graduated from Mount Allison University in 1938 as a dietitian. In 1940, she married Samuel Davis. They did have 4 sons, Roy, Gary, Jan, and Alan. And they did eventually move to 6th Street in the city's North End. But Gladys Davis joined Hadassah, but she was also well known for her knitting and her sewing. And for a period of time in the 1960s, she had a home-based business, and she was making hats. Her business was called Hats by Glad. And we have quite a few of her hats in our collection, and some of them are quite unique, very interesting, certainly fit into the styles of the times. And of course, her larger claim to fame is, of course, having been married to the first and so far only Jewish mayor of the city. I'm not sure when we talk about Sam Davis, maybe when we have a walk that takes us down 6th Street. The youngest child in that family is Clinton Wiesel, and he was born in 1922. He served in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Second World War. But in the 1950s is when he really made a name for himself as a portrait and commercial photographer. And he did the usual assortment of weddings, family portraits, individuals. He also took commercial photography, so businesses, workplaces, factories. Some of his portraits were prominent people in the city. So you can think of people like Casey Irving and the artist Miller Britton. And Miller Britton reciprocated by painting a picture of Clint Wiesel, which I think Clint Wiesel's son still has. When he was taking photographs, he was using an 8-inch by 10-inch Ansco portrait camera, and he pioneered a dye transfer method, which created long-lasting colored prints. So a lot of the prints that he took, 60 years ago, look just about as good as the day they were taken. And when his photography career ended, he went into insurance sales, and then he had a 3rd career as a herb farmer outside of Hampton. So the other half of that 23 to 25 Orange Street house was occupied by the Cohen family. So Israel Cohen and Freda Cohen. And I just have to turn a couple of pages here. So Israel Cohen, people may remember as an accountant. He had his business on Germain Street. I think he did the books for the synagogue for a number of years. His brother Harry was a salesman and a manager at Calps. So I'll tie us into a family coming up down the street. And Freda Cohen was involved with Hadassah Witzo. Must have done a lot because she was the cover portrait of the 1982 edition of the calendar. And let's see, she was the daughter of Nathan and Rose Jacobson. And her sister, Ada Lieberman, who we'll get to shortly, just lived a little farther down the street. They did have two children, Sharon and Edwin Harris. Sharon just passed away this past fall, but she was married to Charles Flam of Montreal for almost 60 years. And they had two daughters, Shelley and Heather. And Ed Harris studied law at Dalhousie and Harvard Universities and lives in Halifax. So our next house, the double house, 67 to 69 Orange Street. And sticking with the same architectural style, another version of the craftsman style house. And this house was built for the Bernstein and Lieberman families in 1931, and they took up residence in this building in 1932. So, Mitchell Bernstein was born in New York City in 1895. Moved to Montreal when he was 10 years old and grew up in the St. Urbain Street neighborhood. It's the same one that Mordecai Richler made famous. And by 1917, Mitchell Bernstein was working with famous players' theaters out of New York City. And he was traveling from theater to theater, bringing the movies. And he also introduced the talking films to St. John audiences. His travels brought him to St. John, where he did meet the lady who would become his wife. And this was Clara Goldfeather. And Clara had been born in Camden, New Jersey in 1902. And then the Goldfeather family moved to St. John. Now, Clara and Mitchell met at a YMHA dance. By the time Clara was only 17 years old. And her parents' home took in boarders. So Mitchell Bernstein became one of the boarders so that he could visit Clara a little more often. But her parents said she was too young to be courted. So he had to wait until she was 20 years old before he could give her a ring. And they were married in June of 1992. And they did have two children. And Mitchell Bernstein was described as a born showman. One of the things he did is he brought back all of the latest dance steps from his trips to New York City, and then he would teach everybody how to dance. He also produced the YMHA shows in the 1940s, and all of the cast members came from the Jewish community with their singing skills and their dancing skills and maybe their acting skills. And apparently he was never seen without a cigar in his hand, as you can see in the picture. And I was told he would even have the cigar with him while he was floating on his back in the river in Pamdenak near his summer cottage. But he also had his newspaper. Now, I think, I will honestly admit it, so I could not imagine floating on my back in the river with my cigar and my newspaper, keeping both my tobacco and the newspaper dry. Sadly, there are no photographs of this, although I wish. So if somebody has a time machine and a camera that I can take back, it would be perfect. Mitchell Bernstein was also president of the congregation. He did a lot of fundraising for the Israel Bond and United Israel Appeal dinners in the 40s and 50s. And these efforts had him honored with the first annual Negev testimonial dinner at the Admiral Beatty Hotel. And this was one of, I don't know, there were probably about 20 dinners altogether over the years. Now, I'm just going to take And he was the founder as well of the B&L theater chain. So there were 20 theaters in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Maine. And he later became a property developer. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm just going to go back to Clara for a second. Wherever the rest of her notes went. So she belonged to the Women's Hospital Aid. She was helping organize for the St. John Music Festivals and was involved in the community. And they had, of course, 2 children. Not quite sure how to even summarize Erminie Cohen's career, because we all know that she was absolutely amazing. And I just have to find her page. So she was a graduate of Mount Allison University. And in 1948, she married her childhood sweetheart, Eddie Cohen. They had gone through school together. And they worked together at Hoffman's Ladies Wear on Main Street in the city's North End. And right from the beginning, she was a volunteer in the community and an advocate for social justice in the community. In 1978, she was appointed to the first New Brunswick Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And this led to the organization St. John Women for Action, and ultimately to the development of the Hestia House building, a shelter for abused women and children. She was involved with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada in various capacities, including as Atlantic Vice President. And in 1993, she was appointed to the Canadian Senate. And she was known there for her compassion and her activism and her work on issues around poverty. And in 1997, she published a report called Sounding the Alarm. And she also, when her time in the Senate was up, and when she turned 75, and everybody in town was clamoring for her to join their organization, she chose to join as the first chair of the New Brunswick Adoption Foundation. And during her time in that position, 1,000 New Brunswick children found forever families. I have probably in the museum a couple of large Rubbermaid buckets with different awards and things that she was presented with. And I'll just limit the list to the Order of Canada, the Order of New Brunswick, the Red Cross Humanitarian Award. She also had the Queen's Silver, Gold, and Diamond Jubilee medals, so the whole 3 sets. A Red Triangle Award from the YMCA, Doctor of Laws from the University of New Brunswick in St. John. And within the community, she was the first female president of the Jewish congregation here. Was also extensively involved in Hadassah, locally, regionally, and nationally. And she was honored with 2 different dinners, the State of Israel Bonds Dinner in 1975, and a Negev dinner in 1998, which led to the founding of the New Brunswick Forest in Israel. And again, if you go back to the museum website, there's a presentation by Terry Levine that we had a couple of years ago talking about the trip that Erminie Cohen and other people at that dinner went to in Israel, what they saw, what they did, and ultimately the planting of those trees. And that probably only doesn't even scratch the surface of everything that she's accomplished. Her brother, Morty Bernstein, graduated from St. John High and from Mount Allison. And he followed his father into business, so into the film business, into film distribution, and then into property development. Solatour Terrace, building at the foot of Union Street. It used to have a bowling alley. I think it's all completely a condo development at this point. Also developed the subdivisions in Milledgeville, where a number of families lived and where the St. John Airport used to be, as well as a series of apartment buildings on what became Mitchell Street. And apparently he was also involved in one of the early drive-in restaurants in the city, the Roll and Shake. But he left the city in the 1980s to join his children in Toronto. So the other half of that house was where the Liebermans lived. And so Avram Lieberman no, sorry, Joshua Lieberman, was also involved in the film business, and he started as a theater usher in 1913. And he traveled as a distributor across Canada and the United States, had become friends with Mitchell Bernstein by 1915. And their partnership led them to St. John. Joshua Lieberman was a charter member of the Motion Picture Pioneers and the Canadian Picture Pioneers Association. He also was president of the congregation for 9 years, from 1947 to 1956, and was also at the head of organizing in the community for any of the Zionist causes, whether it was for the Israel Bonds campaigns, for the Ezra Lodge, for the United Jewish Appeal, Jewish National Fund. So he also got a Negev dinner, but he had to wait until 1957. And he was involved with other things outside of the Jewish community. So he belonged to the Masonic Order, the St. John United Fund, or the United Way, the St. John Board of Trade. He was involved as well with the Rotary Club. And he was among that group that established the Boys and Girls Club in the city. And he raised $30,000 in support of that club on his own. And that was, which was about 1/4 of what they needed. So pretty ambitious. He married as well. He married Ada Jacobson Lieberman. I remember her sister was up the street, Freda Cohen. And her husband was busy, but so was Ada. She had been originally her husband's secretary, so that's how they met. She served 8 terms as Hadassah president in St. John, and she was the first Hadassah regional chair for New Brunswick. She was also president of Sisterhood at one point, and she was well known for hosting teas and dinners to raise funds, both in her Orange Street home and in her cottage out in Pamtenack. And apparently she was also quite a card player, and when she was partnered in bridge with her sister Freda Cohen, I guess they were unbeatable. So her accomplishments. Stanley Lieberman, one of their 2 sons, the older of them, was working with his father at B&L Theaters, but because he had been born in the United States, he was subject to the US draft. And so he did serve in the United States Army during the Korean War. And he was posted to Japan as part of the occupation force. And his jobs were to show films and to take photographs. And then he later came back to New York to work in public relations and in advertising. The other child in that family was Avram Lieberman, and he spent his career in life insurance in Ontario. And he also worked for 20 years as the founder of the Retirement Education Center, which specialized in teaching retirement planning. Because I guess when retirement comes, I'll find out someday, long into the future, but apparently not everybody's ready for that. And he was able to help them along the way. Okay, so what's next? The Gus family at 70 Orange Street. So the house that they lived in was built back in 1878, and it was built for a ship owner in the city, Howard Troop. And the nice feature of this house, I don't know if it still does, but certainly in those days, it had an unobstructed view of the harbor. So I suppose Mr. Troop could see his ships coming and going. And the inside of the house included a grand staircase. And when I was doing my research, I found a real estate listing from this house from a few years back that noted that the building had 8 bedrooms and 9 fireplaces. The Gus family moved into this house in 1947. And when they purchased the house, it had been used as a recreation center for the Navy League during the Second World War. And Mr. and Mrs. Gus lived in this building until the 1970s. So Ben Gus, when we were starting this, mentioned that he was everybody's lawyer, was actually born in Dorbian, Lithuania. and arrived in St. John at the age of 2. He came with his parents, Morris and Celia Gus, who had a house at the corner of Summer Street. So if you come back for the Summer Street walk, we'll talk more about the Gus family in general. So Ben Gus graduated from Dalhousie University in 1930 with his law degree and was called to the New Brunswick Bar in 1931. By 1952, he was named as a Queen's Counsel, and in 1971 became a judge of the family court. I'm just going to see if I just move everybody over a little bit. Family Court Division, Probate Court, and was an administrator of the Federal Court for Taxation and Citizenship. And he retired in 1974. During his legal career, he did review 500 provincial regulations and drafted 100 pieces of legislation in the province that brought civic, county, and provincial governments into the modern age. He was the president of the St. John Law Society, was first chairman of the Legal Aid Committee, and he also did some other things besides the law. So he was one of the founders of St. John Young Judea. He was involved or led the St. John Community Concert Association, was one of the founders of the New Brunswick Competitive Festival of Music, was involved with the St. John Symphony and the St. John Opera Company. And in this musical career that he had, the house at 70 Orange Street became the place where the visiting musicians or adjudicators stayed. And the guest list included people like Sir Ernest Macmillan, who conducted the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, Yehudi Menuhin, Paul Robeson, and Itzhak Perlman. And he also hosted Jack Cummings, who had come from St. John, and was the brother or cousin of Nathan Cummings, who owned Consolidated Grocers. And he ultimately did get an honorary doctorate from UNB, and he was also involved with the development of the St. John Boys and Girls Club. So very, very busy person. Millie Gus was born in St. George in 1908, and she married Ben Gus in December 1938 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. They did have 4 children, Karen, Faith, Judy, and Jonathan. And she worked alongside her husband to promote music in St. John and to encourage musical involvement for her children. And I'm going to read something that takes a little bit of space, but it's memories from Karen, Judy, Faith, and Jonathan about growing up in the Gus family home, in which they contributed for an exhibit we did a few years ago. So they wrote this: our parents, Millie and Ben Gus, played classical music records constantly. Between the records, the radio, the Steinway piano, and 4 children, the house was never quiet. Every Saturday afternoon was reserved for listening to the Metropolitan Opera, which was broadcast live on the radio from New York City. Ben played the violin, which he had learned as a child, and often had evening musicales at our house with other amateur musicians. Millie herself played the piano and sat with all 4 of us as we practiced the piano each day. Broadway songs were not excluded from our musical education, and Judy recalled, Ben and Millie took us to see a Broadway musical in New York City almost every year. They always bought the soundtrack of any show we saw. When we returned to St. John, we played the record so often we memorized every word of every song. Ben and Millie loved Gershwin, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, and Jerome Kern, and these songs were available to us on records, sheet music, and songbooks. Often Karen played with the rest of us standing around the piano singing. If they didn't find these songbooks on their visits to New York, our parents would order them from Ben Goldstein, who owned the local music store. And although rock and roll was definitely not something that Ben and Millie introduced to their children, our house seemed to be a magnet for all of our high school friends in the 1950s. Our sunroom became the after-school dance center for St. John High School, with dozens of teenagers daily rocking to the beat of Elvis Presley or Bill Haley. Millie rarely missed a cultural event that came to St. John. In this context, she discovered Glenn Gould as a young unknown pianist playing Bach at a community concert in the high school auditorium. Gould soon became an international star in the music world when he recorded the Goldberg Variations, who played that record even more than any of the Broadway show records. Incidentally, Ben was the president of the community concerts in St. John for many years and held the meetings in our living room at 70 Orange Street. Visiting musicians in the concert series would often practice on our Steinway before performing their concerts at the high school. And Faith remembers, when Glenn Gould practiced on our piano, we sat on the steps to the second floor like quiet little mice with huge ears. And Jonathan remembers another musician. Itzhak Perlman spent the afternoon at the house before a concert. He played chess with me at the end of the dining room table. I didn't know what I was doing, and he was very good. As Ben, our father, remembered that day, after the chess game, Perlman pulled out his violin and warmed up before heading off to give his concert at the high school. After the community concerts, our parents would hold a reception at the house for the performers and a guest list of local lovers of the arts. We were allowed to stay up and help. And Millie sometimes took her 4 children out of school to attend weekday matinees of special cultural events that played at the Capitol Theater. Among these were the ballet film The Red Shoes. Our parents loved the ballet, perhaps because music is such an integral part of the dance. We saw many dance troupes that performed in St. John. And of course, we 3 sisters all took ballet lessons at the Y. And today, they're everywhere. So Karen and Judy are both in Massachusetts. Faith is in Norway, and Jonathan's in Toronto, although I think I heard him say today he's in Arizona, so where there's no snow. Lucky him. So at 78 Orange Street, we have the Kelp family. And this is another older home and dated from 1879. And it was built by William Fisher, and he was part of the company Emerson and Fisher. And among the things they had in their business was the Enterprise Foundry in Sackville, New Brunswick. And Mr. Fisher was also the founder of the New Brunswick Tourism Association. So the Kelp family moved to this house from Spring Street in the Valley in the early 1940s. And the Kelps lived in this house for about 50 years. So Abraham Kelp was born in Odessa, Russia in 1905, and the family came to St. John and arrived here in 1926. It took 2 years to make the journey to escape from Russia after the Russian Revolution and after the family's store in Russia was taken over by the Bolsheviks. They crossed initially into Romania illegally with the help of relatives. And they were supposed to have gone to the United States, but because the borders were closed to them, they were able to get a visa to enter Canada. And they arrived on December the 2nd, 1926. And Abe Kelp arrived in St. John with his wife, Fina. They had married just before leaving Eastern Europe. He also came with his brother, Jack, and a couple of other family members. When he started out here in St. John, he worked briefly for Harry Davis in construction and then opened his first store in 1933 and was one of the first stores in the city to sell goods on credit. And he moved the store a little further down the street a few years later and ended up with frontage on both Charlotte Street and King Square. The store was destroyed by fire in 1943, but it didn't take them long to rebuild. And by the time the store closed for good in 1993, it was one of the largest independent department stores in the Maritime provinces. And going through the old newspapers, they took out large advertisements, usually on page 5, sometimes just part of the page, sometimes the whole page. And sometimes they would even have an entire printed 8 or 12 page flyer, full-size sheets. The store sold women's and men's clothing, children's clothing, shoes. There was a wedding department and a bargain basement. And the store was well known for the quality of its merchandise, its Christmas window displays, and the annual bridal shows. And at one point, there were 70 people working in this store. Because of the promise of the store, perhaps, Abe Kalp was the first chairman of the St. John's Merchants Association. He was a charter member of the Retail Council of Canada. He also served 3 terms as president of the congregation. He was also vice president of the Zionist Organization of Canada and did a lot of fundraising for Israel Bonds, Jewish National Fund. He had his Negev dinner in 1955. And he was also involved outside of the Jewish community. So the New Brunswick Competitive Festival of Music, he belonged to the Union Club, the Masonic Order, the Symphony Orchestra, the hospital boards. He also founded the Fundy Linen Service, which did all of the hospital laundry. And he received the Canada 125 medal in recognition of his community contributions. So incredibly accomplished. His wife, Fina, they got married in 1924. She was only 17 years old when they got married. He was 19. And they had 3 daughters, Marie, Lucille, and Francine. So I know that Marie was married in the 1950s and that she owned an antique shop in Toronto and that they had 3 children. And Lucy, I have some extra notes here that I picked up yesterday, but Lucille Kalp was one of the first young women in the community to train and practice as a lawyer. So she was called to the New Brunswick Bar in 1953. And in the 1970s, she was doing legal research at Dalhousie University. And she researched a book written, the lead author in the book was Lauren Rozovsky. So Rozovsky is probably another familiar St. John name. And it was the Canadian Hospital Law book. So sort of the merging of medical or laws around medicine. And in one of the editions of the book, she is listed as a co-author, which I thought was kind of interesting. Her husband, Donald Kerr, was also a lawyer. And in 1976, in the congregation newsletter, she was congratulated on her presentation on land registration rules that were being updated in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And then Francine Goldsmith was the youngest child in that family, so a graduate of McGill University. She married Lloyd Goldsmith in 1958 and they had 2 children, Mark and Renee. Some of these things I didn't find out about Francine until it was much too late, that she was actually quite involved in sports, that she was a basketball player, that she was a curler. And in fact, her curling team came second in a New Brunswick curling championship. She was also a golfer and she was a bridge player at the level of Life Masters. So I'm suspecting the card playing capacities on Orange Street were pretty impressive. And that you may have played cards against some of these ladies at your peril, particularly if there was any money on the line. And finally, much further down the hill, we have 146 Orange Street, which is where the Grossweiner family lived. And this house was built in 1927. So it goes back to that simpler craftsman style type of house. And parts of this block actually survived the Great St. John fire. So this was probably built on an empty lot of some sort. So the Grossweiner family moved into this building in the 1950s. And so we have Sidney Grossweiner, who was born in St. John in 1910, and his parents were Max and Ida Grossweiner. And he was a store clerk in the Basson store and then in the Margolian shoe store in the 1920s. And worked in stores until he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1943 and served for a year as a wireless operator posted in St. John, Halifax, and Ottawa. And after the war, he opened his own store, the New Mode Ladies Apparel Shop on Charlotte Street. The store carried higher end ladies wear, so it would have been on a par with Druskin's or Hoffman's. The store also had a bridal boutique and a children's department. And his wife, Ella, who he married in 1943 before heading off into the Air Force, assisted him in the store. And I have a memory here that his daughter Susan shared about the store. I remember watching Queen Elizabeth from New Mode's upper window. He was somehow involved in the local Easter parade. And she used to get paid 25 cents an hour to help in the store watch for theft. Susan also remembers having a Halloween party upstairs in the store. And I do have some pictures from that party, I think. Sidney Grossweiner was active in the local Chamber of Commerce and loved the store and the business. But because there was a lot of credit going on in the store and people didn't always pay their bills on time, made things a little bit difficult and brought the store to an end. So later in the 1950s, he switched careers and was selling life insurance until his retirement. But he was also involved in the YMHA, was on the synagogue board. He graced the stage as a member of the Jewish Community Players, and he was also involved in the JC's organization. Now, Ella Grossweiner was born in 1921, and her parents were Alexander and Bessie Lesser, and she was involved in the artistic life in St. John. So she was a stage manager and set builder for the St. John Theatre Guild. She was on the St. John Arts Council. She was involved with the New Brunswick Museum and the New Brunswick Historical Society and the Women's Symphony Committee, and probably many others. In 1961 and 1962, she was president of the local Council of Women. And under her leadership, the organization led its support to the development of UNB St. John. And she campaigned for votes for women in municipal elections. So even in the 1960s, women were still fighting for the right to vote. In 1979, she took on her most prominent role when she became the first cultural affairs officer of the city of St. John, and kept that role until her retirement in 1986. And under her guidance there, she created the City Gallery and the St. John Arts Center, and was awarded a Canada 125 medal. Now, the position for which she was the first person, there have only ever been 3 people in that position. And the third person who holds that comparable position is Dan Ullman's daughter, Kate. It's been changed up a little bit, but it's nice that it's come back around to the Jewish community. And they had 2 children, Martin and Susan. Susan had a career as a teacher in St. John and in Edmonton. I'm friends with one of her former students and recently moved to Toronto. Martin, I believe, was well known as a landscape photographer based in Fredericton. And we actually had a show of his work in the museum quite a number of years ago. And when I go to Fredericton and I go to the farmer's market in Fredericton, he has this little shop in the corner where people bring their knives and scissors and things to be sharpened, which I think is pretty neat as a retirement career. So we've made it to the bottom of the street. We've made it to the end of the walk. I'm just going to come back to this for a second. I just want to make sure I get the next 2 things in just before I open up the floor. So this is only the first walk. Everybody who is here today is on the list for the other walks as well. So you're welcome to join us next week because we go for a walk down King Street East and then Leinster Street and Elliott Row. And then we'll take a little break for the March break in case you have grandchildren popping up. And then we're going to take a couple of turns around the cemetery with the war veterans, merchants of Main Street, and people who had the misfortune to die of murder, illness, or accident. And then we'll come back to one last street in April. And you'll notice again a big gap. The original schedule, I had the Summer Street walk just as you would be getting ready to prepare for your Passover Seder. So, and when someone brought that to my attention, I decided I'd better let you finish your meal preparations, and we would put Summer Street off until Passover was over. And it gives me 2 more weeks to write, which may be important. And I'm just thought I'd throw this in, that our coming exhibit for 2023 is coming of age, bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah celebrations. So if you have bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah memories to share, invitations, photographs, kippahs, and other things, we would love to have them for our exhibit. Could be you, it could be your children, maybe your grandchildren. Got lots of empty space and a freshly painted display room just waiting for all of your wonderful stories. So I'm just going to back this up. So I'm hoping, and this is the reason I wanted to record it, because if you have memories and comments and corrections, I want to be able to keep track of them.